Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for coming out on a rainy night, and when I think it's a night when many of us are thinking about tomorrow, and maybe we'll take our minds off that for a few minutes here. It's really an honor to be here in this beautiful room, in this beautiful building, and also knowing some of the other authors who have spoken here, among them Edmund Morris, who is really a hero of mine. Anyone who hasn't read his Teddy Roosevelt trilogy really should do that. So I'll begin tonight by setting the scene. Amazing new technologies are creating vast fortunes in the United States, but only for a select few. Many other Americans are stuck in poverty, and the gap between rich and poor has grown to an unprecedented level. Large corporations and the super rich are exerting tremendous influence on the political process, using money and lobbyists to bend government policy to their will. Immigrants are transforming the country. Slavery is a thing of the past, but African Americans still face discrimination. Many Americans still pine for the previous President of the United States, a family man from the Midwest with impressive academic credentials and high morals. His surprise successor couldn't be more different. A Republican, he is a wealthy New Yorker who made a chunk of his fortune in shady real estate deals. He enjoys living the high life and takes great pride in wearing the finest clothes and eating and drinking the best that money can buy. The country is shocked when he unexpectedly lands on the threshold of the highest office in the land, but no more shocked than he is. In his heart, he fears that he is unqualified for the job, and most of his countrymen, even many Republicans, tend to agree with him. His only loyalty, they fear, is to his friends and to himself. Elites in the big cities are especially horrified. They say the president is corrupt, a criminal who belongs in jail, not the White House. Some of the people around the president fear he is mentally unbalanced. Even anonymously, they say this in the New York Times. I should note that the New York Times said about Chester Arthur, about the last man who would be considered eligible for the presidency. And, like another president, he has remarkable hair. I'm speaking, of course, about the situation in America in the summer of 1881, the year this magnificent building was completed, and Chester Alan Arthur. Arthur, our country's 21st president, often lands on lists of the most obscure presidents. To tell the truth, based on a regular poll of college students, he is the most obscure president. Few Americans know anything about him, and even history buffs mostly recall him for his distinctive facial hair, those magnificent mutton chop sideburns. Sure, many people flock to Arthur's former home at 123 Lexington Avenue, between 28th and 29th Streets, a brownstone that still stands. But most of them are there to shop at Khalistan's, a store that sells Indian and Middle Eastern spices and foods, not to see the only standing building in New York City where a president took the oath of office. Arthur's statue in Madison Square Park, erected by his friends in 1899, is ignored. In fact, whenever I go there, I'm the only person there. I've been several times now. So why write a book about Chester Arthur? I get that question a lot. The easy answer is somebody had to do it. As one of my brothers said, any fool can write about Lincoln. Now, I don't want to disparage Doris Kearns Goodwin or the many, many other worthy Lincoln biographers, and certainly Abe is a worthy subject. But I believe that Chester Arthur is as well. Arthur rose to prominence and served as president during a crucial period in American history, one with many parallels to our own time. We frequently dissect and rehash the events of the Civil War, and rightly so, but we often ignore the crucial decades immediately following the war. We shouldn't. The social, political, and economic changes that shook America during the 1870s and 1880s were the birth pangs of the society we have today. Arthur became president 137 years ago, but the era that Mark Twain dubbed the Gilded Age doesn't feel quite so distant at a time when political corruption, economic inequality, and corporate malfeasance are once again shaking many of us to our core. Arthur was born in 1829, the son of a rigid abolitionist preacher. He graduated from Union College in Schenectady in 1848, determined to become a lawyer. After a few months at the State and National Law School in Ballston Spa, upstate, he worked as a teacher and principal while continuing to study the law on his own. Several years later, he did what many ambitious young men from the hinterlands do. He moved here to New York City. Here, he joined the law firm of Erastus Culver, an abolitionist friend of his father's. At first, he longed for his family and friends. "I sometimes get very weary and tired of city life and think I would not like to pass my days here after all," he wrote to one friend in December 1853. "Yet if one is ambitious and makes it the great object of life to succeed, there is no doubt but this is the place." Not long before, English writers had belittled Broadway's flimsy wood frame houses and stubby brick stores. But by the time Arthur arrived in March 1853, they marveled that Broadway's marble and granite stores and hotels were, quote, "more like the palaces of kings than places for the transaction of business." The young Arthur admired the businessmen who swaggered down Broadway in their conservative suits, the bearded dandies who strutted by wearing slim trousers, and the women who floated above the pavement in their fluttering ribbons and rainbow silks. To an immigrant preacher's son from upstate, all of this seemed otherworldly, and yet not unattainable. This was not Europe, where the rich were aristocrats who had inherited their money and didn't work. The wealthiest New Yorkers were businessmen, most of them still actively engaged in commerce. Americans had heard the term millionaire for the first time during the 1840s, and many of the men who had earned that title had come from nothing. Men such as John Jacob Astor, a poor German immigrant boy who amassed $20 million trading furs and buying and selling New York real estate. Or Cornelius Vanderbilt, who launched a ferry service between Staten Island and Manhattan at the age of 16 and transformed it into a steamship and rail empire. And yet there was another side of New York, one that could be glimpsed by peering down Broadway's side streets, where pigs picked over rotten vegetables, worn-out shoes, lidless flour barrels, and earthenware jars full of coal ashes. On those streets, ragged women carried bundles of broken boards and old timbers from demolished buildings. Hobbled old men and scrawny girls in filthy cotton frocks carried cedar pails filled with ears of corn for sale. Many of the poorest New Yorkers were recent immigrants. By 1850, nearly half of the city's residents had been born overseas. The newcomers, most of them Irish and German, were packed into squalid, suffocating tenements in slums such as Five Points, where cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis were rampant, and the murder rate was the highest in the Western world. Less than half of the children born in the city in the 1850s survived to the age of 6. In this city of stark contrasts and multiple nationalities, Black New Yorkers occupied peculiar ground. Freed from slavery in 1827, they were native-born Americans who were treated as second-class citizens, at best. Like immigrants, they were forced to live in neighborhoods shunned by the middle and upper classes. They were barred from many restaurants and workplaces, and attended segregated schools and churches. Some of the omnibuses and horse-drawn streetcars barred all Black riders, while others restricted them to specially designated cars that ran at infrequent intervals. A young African-American schoolteacher who refused to tolerate the indignity that she suffered on a streetcar, gave Chester Arthur his first chance to shine as an attorney. 27-year-old Elizabeth Jennings taught at the private African Free School and was the organist at the First Colored Congregational Church. On Sunday, July 16, 1854, Elizabeth and her friend Sarah Adams walked to the corner of Pearl and Chatham Streets to catch the 3rd Avenue streetcar. The first car that arrived did not have the Colored Persons Allowed placard in its rear window, but the women were running late for church, so they hailed the car and it stopped. Holding her bonnet in place with one hand and clutching her organ music in the other, Elizabeth stepped forward to board the car. Even though the driver had pulled over to allow Jennings and Adams to board, the conductor blocked her way, informing her in a thick Irish brogue that the car was full. Jennings recalled later, "He then told me that the other car had my people in it, that it was appropriate for my people. I told him I had no people. I wished to go to church and did not wish to be detained." The conductor relented. "Well, you may go in," he said, "but remember, if the passengers raise any objections, you shall go out." This pricked the pride of the young teacher. "I'm a respectable person, born and raised in New York," she declared, her voice rising in anger. "I don't know where you were born, but you are a good-for-nothing, impudent fellow for insulting decent persons while on their way to church." The conductor was enraged. He grabbed Jennings to eject her from the car, but she got hold of the window sash and refused to budge. "Do not lay hands on me," she cried. Together, the conductor and the driver seized the teacher's arms and began dragging her from the car. "You'll kill her! Don't kill her!" Adams cried. The driver released his grip and returned to his reins. The streetcar went on, but as soon as the driver spied a policeman, he halted the horses, and the policeman boarded the car and ordered Jennings out of it. With the financial backing of New York's black community, Jennings filed a lawsuit against the conductor, the driver, and the 3rd Avenue Railroad Company, seeking $500 in damages. Thomas Jennings hired the firm of Culver, Parker, and Arthur to represent his daughter. And Culver assigned the case to 24-year-old Chester, the firm's junior partner. And he won. The jury awarded Jennings $225, to which the court added $25 plus costs. The Jennings decision did not immediately desegregate all of New York's streetcar lines, but it set that process in motion. For years after, New York City's black community celebrated the anniversary of the verdict. During this period, Arthur became increasingly interested in politics. On election days, he worked as an inspector at a polling place. And in 1856, he worked on the campaign of the military officer and explorer John C. Fremont, the Republican Party's first presidential nominee. Arthur's growing involvement in Republican politics allowed him to observe and learn from a master of the game, Thurlow Weed. Great name. Weed was New York's undisputed Republican boss. Business and politics were being braided together, and the man who was known as the Wizard of the Lobby derived his power from those thickening ties. Weed hobnobbed with bank presidents and railroad tycoons, merchants and ship owners. The businessmen provided a steady source of money for campaigns. Weed repaid them by soliciting their views on legislation relating to railroads, steamboats, wharfs, or anything else that might affect their fortunes. One of Weed's main responsibilities as political boss was to distribute government jobs to the party faithful. At the bottom of the patronage pyramid were jobs such as laborer, street sweeper, and bell ringer. Moving up, there were positions for policemen, health wardens, tax assessors, judges, and commissioners of deeds. Weed could help a loyal Republican get elected as a local alderman, or a mayor, or a state assemblyman. At the top of the patronage heap were the coveted federal jobs, about 700 of them at the New York Custom House. New York City was the main port of entry for goods entering the U.S., and the Custom House collected about 75% of the nation's import duties. Those who lived in the mansions on Fifth Avenue thought that government jobs, especially local ones, were undignified. Upper-class reformers believed public offices were a public trust and should be divorced from individual interests. But people on society's lower rungs saw things differently. They sought government jobs because they craved a steady salary and a sense of identity, a way up. They believed that if you worked hard on behalf of a victorious political party or faction, a patronage job was your just reward. Weed was an unabashed defender of the so-called spoils system. He argued that the regular rotation of public jobs was fair and democratic. Patronage was the oil that lubricated the Republican machine, perpetuating Weed's power. It also provided a steady flow of campaign contributions through so-called voluntary assessments, which were in reality not voluntary at all, and they were levied on office holders' salaries. Chester Arthur embraced Weed's approach to politics. On election days, he was impressed when he watched Weed's heelers break up lines of opposing voters and flagrantly stuff ballot boxes. This was how the game was played. In 1860, soon after being elected to a second two-year term, New York's Republican governor, Edwin Morgan, decided to form a new general staff, a corps of young men outfitted in uniforms and gold braid, whose job was to appear martial at public ceremonies. At Weed's suggestion, Morgan invited Arthur to join the group. At first, the job was purely ornamental, but with the attack on Fort Sumter and the beginning of the Civil War, it became deadly serious. On April 15, 1861, President Lincoln proclaimed that there was an insurrection in the South and called for 75,000 loyal Union men to crush it. Recruiting and equipping those troops would be up to individual states. Each governor oversaw his own War Department, and the federal government took control of the regiments formed by each state only when they had reached full strength. On April 16th, the New York legislature approved $3 million to recruit, arm, and equip 30,000 troops for 2 years of service. In New York City, there was an outpouring of popular enthusiasm. Hundreds of thousands of shouting and singing people attended rallies in Union Square. Recruits, still in their civilian clothes, paraded up and down Broadway in front of cheering multitudes. The stars and stripes hung from every window in the city, and every vehicle, it seemed, was decked out in red, white, and blue. The challenge for Governor Morgan was to channel that popular enthusiasm into the recruitment of real soldiers, trained and equipped for battle. For that, he turned to Arthur. Morgan made the young lawyer a brigadier general and assigned him to be the state Quartermaster General's New York City representative. Arthur would be responsible for feeding, housing, clothing, and equipping thousands of enlisted men. Arthur awarded contracts, audited expenditures, and quickly became an expert in rations, blankets, ammunition, and underwear. This is the 7th Regiment marching through New York. Arthur performed his duties so well that Morgan promoted him to Inspector General and then Quartermaster General for the state of New York. Arthur's responsibilities broadened. He inspected forts and defenses throughout New York and helped come up with a plan to protect New York Harbor from what many expected to be an imminent attack by the British Navy. Arthur also had to navigate perilous shoals at home, though, where his wife Nell, who was from a prominent Virginia family, was a quiet but steadfast Confederate sympathizer. The war was not going well for the Union in the fall of 1862. Tens of thousands had been killed or maimed at Shiloh, 7 Days, Second Bull Run, and Antietam. The eruption of public enthusiasm that followed the attack on Fort Sumter had dissipated. In November, voters in New York registered their discontent with the ruling Republicans at the ballot box. Morgan, who had his eye on a U.S. Senate seat, declined to run again for governor, and a Democrat took over. On January 1st, 1863, Morgan and his staff, including Arthur, lost their military commissions. Though Arthur could have volunteered to fight, he didn't. One reason was that the new governor was unlikely to give him a commission as high-ranking as the one he was being forced to give up. Family tension was another deterrent. But there was another factor. Arthur wanted to get rich. His military service had given him an array of useful contacts, and he had become an expert in supplies, contracts, and military law. Many people with similar skills and experience were making fortunes. Chester Arthur set out to do the same. He cashed in on his knowledge and connections by lobbying for clients seeking government contracts in Washington and Albany. With his ballooning income, Arthur purchased the brownstone row house on Lexington Avenue. Nell filled the house with the finest furniture and accessories, and Chester hired a staff of Irish immigrant servants. Lucrative military contracts vanished with the war's end, but Arthur continued to prosper through his deepening involvement in New York's Republican machine. His personality helped. Arthur was stimulating company, always ready with a humorous story or apt limerick, and he spent most nights with other politicos, smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, and hashing out strategy into the early morning hours. Before long, Arthur became a top lieutenant to U.S. Senator Roscoe Conkling, the new boss of the New York Republican machine. At Conkling's urging, in 1871, President Grant appointed Arthur collector of the New York Custom House. It was a lucrative opportunity. When the Custom House fined merchants for violations, Chet Arthur took a cut. He lived in a world of Tiffany silver, fine carriages, and grand balls, and had his Prince Albert coats and high hats imported from London. He owned at least 80 pairs of trousers. And during one 8-month period, he spent $125, which is about $2,600 in today's dollars, on hats. When an old college classmate told him his custom house deputy was corrupt, Chet waved him away. "You're one of those goody-goody fellows who set up a high standard of morality that other people cannot reach," he said. The Arthurs' newfound wealth launched them into the upper echelons of New York society. The names in Nell's address book were organized by street and included Vanderbilts and Roosevelts. Hosting such distinguished company in the appropriate style was expensive, and the Arthurs did so regularly. At many such events, the hosts rolled out a carpet from the front door to the curb and covered the walkway with a temporary awning so that guests alighting from their carriages would not have to tread on the sidewalk or be exposed to the elements. Once inside, French servants wearing black swallowtail coats and pants with immaculate white vests, cravats, and gloves fetched food and drink. Arthur still liked to linger late into the night or into the early morning with his political cronies, eating, drinking, smoking Havana cigars, and dreaming up ways to strengthen the machine. On most days, the collector didn't show up at the custom house for work until 1 p.m., 3 hours after it opened. One of the machine boys who participated in the festivities later recalled that, quote, "Arthur was always the last man to go to bed in any company and was fond of sitting down on his front steps at 3 a.m. and talking until anyone dared to stay." Often Arthur and his machine buddies ventured beyond the front stoop. One of the agents later assigned to investigate the custom house alluded to the, quote, "many nefarious places visited at nighttime by Arthur and his friends." Those nefarious places almost certainly included some of New York's many concert saloons, where the waiter girls wore low bodices, short skirts, and high-tasseled red boots. Many of the girls had been camp followers during the war and were available for private appointments in an upstairs room or nearby brothel. A favorite haunt of the time was Harry Hill's, housed in a 2-story brick building at 25 Houston Street. Harry, an English immigrant and former boxer, proudly welcomed members of Congress, judges, lawyers, merchants, doctors, and other well-to-do professionals, along with dock workers and the racetrack crowd. He graciously provided a private sobering-up room for his more respectable customers to reduce their chances of being waylaid by his rougher patrons once they ventured outdoors. In a dingy, low-ceilinged dance hall on the second floor, shop girls frolicked with state legislators, and the wives of prominent lawyers twirled through the sawdust with gangsters from the bloody 6th Ward. The supercilious Senator Conkling happily left the day-to-day management of the state machine to his loyal collector. It was Arthur who had the social skills, and Conkling leaned heavily on him to lubricate the relationships that kept the machine humming. He forged alliances with both Tammany and anti-Tammany Democrats to build Republican strength in New York City. But in 1877, reform-minded Republican Rutherford B. Hayes succeeded the scandal-plagued Grant as president. Soon after taking office, Hayes ordered his Treasury Secretary to investigate charges of political influence and corruption in the nation's custom houses. Arthur managed to hold on to his lucrative post until 1878. Then Hayes fired him. Arthur's political career seemed to be over. But in June 1880, GOP leaders resurrected it. When Republicans gathered in Chicago to pick their presidential nominee, James Garfield, a longtime congressman, upset former President Grant and emerged as the surprise choice. Party elders were desperate to appease Conkling, who had been a Grant supporter, to secure his help in winning New York. The second place on the ticket seemed to be a safe spot for one of Conkling's flunkies. Garfield was young and vigorous, and most believed that a Conkling man could do less damage as vice president than in many other posts. They chose Arthur as the vice presidential nominee, and the Republicans triumphed in November. But on the morning of July 2nd, 1881, a deranged office seeker named Charles Guiteau shot President Garfield in a Washington railroad station. He doesn't look deranged, does he? To Arthur's horror, when Guiteau was arrested immediately afterward, he proclaimed his support for the Arthur Conkling wing of the Republican Party, which had been resisting Garfield's attempts to curb the power of political machines. And he expressed satisfaction that Arthur would now be president. Some newspapers even accused Arthur and Conkling of conspiring to kill Garfield. There's a picture of the shooting in the railroad station. Garfield survived the shooting, but he was mortally wounded. For months, as he lay dying in the White House, Americans prayed for their fallen leader and trembled at the thought of Conkling's stooge leading the nation. Andrew Dixon White, a prominent diplomat and historian of the time, later wrote, "It was a common saying of that time among those who knew him best. Chet Arthur, President of the United States? Good God!" Arthur had never coveted the presidency and could not conceive of leading the country. When newspapers accused him of conspiring to kill Garfield, he avoided appearing in public, fearing his own life might be in danger. His friends worried he was on the verge of an emotional collapse. But at the end of August 1881, as Garfield's condition deteriorated, Arthur received a letter from a fellow New Yorker, a bedridden 31-year-old woman named Julia Sand. Sand was the unmarried eighth daughter of a German immigrant who had risen to become president of the Metropolitan Gas Light Company of New York. She lived at 46 East 74th Street, which was owned by her brother, Theodore, a banker. As the pampered daughter of a wealthy father, Julia read French, enjoyed poetry, and vacationed in Saratoga and Newport. But by the time she wrote Arthur, she was an invalid, plagued by spinal pain and other ailments that kept her at home. As a woman, Julia was excluded from public life, but she followed politics closely through the newspapers, and she had an especially keen interest in Chester Arthur. Arthur had never met Sand, or even heard of her. They were complete strangers, but her words moved him. In her first letter, she wrote, "The hours of Garfield's life are numbered. Before this meets your eye, you may be president. The people are bowed in grief. But do you realize it? Not so much because he is dying, as because you are his successor." What president ever entered office under circumstances so sad? The day he was shot, the thought rose in 1,000 minds that you might be the instigator of the foul act. Is not that a humiliation which cuts deeper than any bullet can pierce? Your best friend said, "Arthur must resign. He cannot accept office with such a suspicion resting upon him." and now your kindest opponents say, Arthur will try to do right, adding gloomily, he won't succeed though. Making a man president cannot change him. But Julia Sand did not share that pessimistic view. She went on, but making a man president can change him, she declared. Great emergencies awaken generous traits which have lain dormant half a life. If there is a spark of true nobility in you, now is the occasion to let it shine. Faith in your better nature forces me to write to you, but not to beg you to resign. Do what is more difficult and more brave. Reform. It is not the proof of highest goodness never to have done wrong, but it is a proof of it, sometime in one's career, to pause and ponder, to recognize the evil, to turn resolutely against it, and devote the remainder of one's life to that only which is pure and exalted. Such resolutions of the soul are not common. No step towards them is easy. And in the humdrum drift of daily life, they are impossible. But once in a while, there comes a crisis which renders miracles feasible. The great tidal wave of sorrow which has rolled over the country has swept you loose from your old moorings and set you on a mountaintop alone. Reformers, and people such as Julia Sand, believed that without civil service reform, American democracy might be doomed. They wanted to destroy the spoil system, to root out patronage and award federal jobs based on competitive examinations, not political connections or contributions. Now they watched in horror as Roscoe Conkling's puppet prepared to bring the worst features of New York machine politics into the White House. The vital question before the country is civil service reform, Sand wrote to Arthur in January 1883. The vital question before you is how you will meet it. Are you a coward? Do you fear to face the same danger that Garfield faced? It is for you to choose. Are you content to sit like a snake charmer and let loathsome serpents coil about you, priding yourself on it that not one of them dares sting you? I would rather think of you like St. George, in shining armor, striking death to the heart of the dragon. Still, it seemed unlikely, if not impossible, that Chester Arthur would disavow the spoil system that had been the whole basis of his political career. As vice president, Arthur had not hesitated to use his position to help his New York cronies, and Conkling and his associates looked forward to reaping the benefits of his elevation to president. This cartoon shows Conkling as the white elephant in the room. But they underestimated the impact of Garfield's suffering and death on their old friend. Arthur surprised Sand and nearly everybody else by becoming a champion of civil service reform, laying the groundwork for the progressive presidents, such as Teddy Roosevelt, who came after him. It was Arthur's major accomplishment in the White House, one that continues to resonate today. Those who rail against a so-called deep state that is disloyal to the president fail to understand that since the passage of civil service reform under Arthur, federal employees aren't supposed to be loyal to a particular president or party. They're supposed to serve the American people. Arthur also embarked on a much-needed rebuilding of the U.S. Navy, setting us on a course to becoming a world power. And since we are here, in a building and in a room famous for the work of Louis Comfort Tiffany, I should mention another one of President Arthur's accomplishments. Before moving into the White House, Arthur launched a major renovation of the mansion. Under his direction, 24 wagon loads of furniture, carpets, and drapes, some dating back to the John Adams administration, were hauled away and sold at public auction. Arthur was friendly with Louis Tiffany's father, the noted jeweler Charles Louis Tiffany. The younger Tiffany had just finished renovating this room that we sit in right now and was becoming well known. Arthur decided to entrust the decoration of the White House public spaces to him. Many parts of the mansion were transformed, but the most spectacular new feature, many said, was the 50-foot jeweled glass screen fitted with imitation marble columns that Tiffany designed to replace the old glass doors that formerly separated the main corridor of the White House from the north vestibule. Sadly, the Tiffany screen was removed during the 1902 renovation of the White House during Roosevelt's administration and sold at auction as boxes of glass for $275. Part of it was installed in the Belvedere Hotel in Chesapeake Beach, Maryland, but the hotel was destroyed by a fire in 1923. So all we have are black and white photographs like this one and our imaginations. Julia Sand continued to write to Arthur throughout 1882 and 1883, and the president heeded much of her advice. He even paid her a surprise visit at her home on East 74th Street. Before concluding, I want to read one more letter that Julia Sand wrote to Chester Arthur, and I love this one because it really illustrates her incredible intimacy with the President of the United States. She writes, "Are you offended with me? Really? Seriously? Do the few harsh things that I've said to you outweigh all else? The fact that for a whole year I have thought of and felt with you in your cares and perplexities? That last summer, when you were bowed down in gloom and seemed almost broken in spirit, I did my best to arouse your manhood and your courage? That I had faith in you when hardly anyone who had the welfare of the country at heart hoped anything good of you? I did not ask you to answer my letters, for I knew you could not speak to me on the subjects I chose to discuss. But it never crossed my mind until now that you distrusted me." Ashamed of the career that he had had before entering the White House, Arthur ordered that most of his papers be burned upon his death. But he spared Sand's letters, 23 of which reside at the Library of Congress. By the time Arthur left the White House, the public's perception of him had been transformed. No man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted as Chester Alan Arthur, and no one ever retired from the highest civil trust of the world more generally respected, alike by political friend and foe, one newspaper editor wrote. Even Mark Twain praised Arthur. He said, "It would be hard indeed to better President Arthur's administration." But if Arthur was so great, why has everybody forgotten about him? I've already alluded to two reasons. He burned his papers, creating a challenge for historians. And he served during an era that's a little bit foggy in the minds of most Americans. He also was very suspicious of the press after the way they had treated him during the summer of 1881. And he did little to cultivate the reporters who covered him. Personally, I think it's a shame that Americans have forgotten their 21st president. 2 years ago, on the eve of our last election, then President Barack Obama warned voters that the presidency doesn't change a person. He said, "Who you are, what you are, it doesn't change after you occupy the Oval Office. It magnifies who you are. It shines a spotlight on who you are." After nearly 2 years in office, it's pretty hard to argue that the presidency has changed Donald Trump. But the story of Chester Alan Arthur calls into question Obama's view. And his story of redemption suggests that the presidency can change a person. At least it did once. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions from the audience.
How many terms and why not more?
Well, I was trying not to give away everything in the book for those of you who haven't read it. I'll say he did not serve a second term for reasons that are interesting and weren't so much a reflection on his performance in office. But so those of you who haven't read the book will have to read it to find out why. Well, and so civil service reform was certainly the biggest. The Navy, which I mentioned, is also a very big one. By the time he took office, the Navy really hadn't been touched since the Civil War. It was all wooden ships, and the officers, many of them used the ships as their private yachts, and we were far, far behind what the European countries were building. And he set us on a course to be a world power and to be a naval power. He understood that we needed a strong Navy to protect our interests around the globe and certainly in our own hemisphere. He also, and I mentioned this in the book, he did, this is sort of a passive accomplishment, but Yellowstone National Park was still fairly new, and the whole idea of national parks. And so he was president during a time when many people, mining interests and others, logging interests, wanted to get at that. And the people who supported keeping the park pristine as it was, invited him to take a trip to Yellowstone, which he did. He was the first president to go to Yellowstone, and that seems to have convinced him to help those in Congress who wanted to hold off those powerful interests that wanted to develop Yellowstone. He also, this one, it was more the sentiments he expressed than an actual accomplishment, but he was also remarkably progressive on the issue of civil rights for his time. During his time in office, the Supreme Court overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which by overturning that, it basically, the court said that you couldn't prevent private businesses from discriminating on the basis of race. And many Republicans, even progressive Republicans at the time, said, you know what, we're not really surprised by this decision. It seemed like overreach at the time when Congress passed it during Reconstruction. In fact, it was buried. The news of the decision really didn't get much play in the newspapers of the time, as I saw in my research. But Arthur was very outspoken in his support for the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and he urged Congress to pass some sort of a law that would withstand judicial scrutiny. They didn't do that, but it was significant, I think, that he expressed those sentiments. And unfortunately, of course, despite what many Republicans believe, that was a momentous decision that really cleared the way for Jim Crow, and we were dealing with that decision, or to some extent still dealing with it, but certainly until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And I mentioned in the book that Frederick Douglass, perhaps not surprising, was one of the people who recognized just how horrible a decision that was and what the impact might be in the decades to come.
I'd like to hear your comments about the immigration questions of the Chinese.
I know, I always get asked about that one. Well, it wasn't Chester's finest moment. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first law that restricted immigration. There was tremendous pressure to pass that law at the time, particularly from people on the West Coast. There was a lot of the Chinese immigrants were providing cheap labor and crowding out native-born Americans and Americans from European countries. And so there was tremendous pressure on Congress to do something. Congress passed an extremely draconian law that would have barred virtually all immigration for 20 years. And Arthur, and I think was a courageous stand, vetoed that law. And in fact, Julius Sand wrote him a letter praising him for that decision. The newspapers that were opposed to the law praised him for that decision. But the support was so great for that legislation that Congress just came back and passed another law that was very similar, cut the term from 20 years to 10, and Arthur did not veto that one, and Julia Sand actually wrote him a letter telling him how disappointed she was. I think it would have been certainly an opportunity for him to stand up again for his principles, and he was very eloquent in his veto message and talking about how the law really contradicted the best American principles, and that even for practical reasons it was a bad idea because it was going to alienate the Chinese and other Asian countries. But he did not, when Congress passed that second version of the bill, he did not veto it.
How did Chester Arthur's wife deal with a woman inviting her husband?
Well, she wasn't around anymore. She died shortly before Chester Arthur became the vice presidential nominee. So, and he felt very guilty about that. I mean, he was, despite his escapades at night, was very committed to her and loved her, and he felt incredibly guilty that she hadn't lived to see the culmination of all that political work. She didn't live to see him become vice president. In fact, there's a scene that I describe in the book where shortly after he returns from Chicago, from the convention, some of his New York friends hosted a dinner for him to celebrate, and his daughter, who was I think 8 or 9 at the time, came in with some flowers to congratulate him. And he got very teary-eyed, and he said, something to the effect that, I can't remember the exact quote, but all these honors don't mean as much to me now as they might have before.
Does Julius seem to have an unusual role in history as someone who is not the head of an organization or very active in politics, who sort of come out of nowhere in a sense?
It is an extraordinary part of the story, I think, and it's one that really struck me when I first heard about it and kind of got me into the whole Chester Arthur story. I mean, certainly at the time, as I noted, there really weren't any outlets for women to be involved in politics. They couldn't vote, let alone run for public office. But she clearly was someone who we describe now as kind of a political junkie. She read all the newspapers and knew everything about Chester Arthur and about the issues of the time. And I think all of that was unusual, and I think that there is good reason to believe, even though Chester Arthur never wrote her back, that he really, well, as far as we know, you should say it. As far as we know, those letters have not survived if he wrote back. She doesn't mention any letters back in the ones that are at the Library of Congress, but. First of all, he followed a lot of her advice, and some of it was very specific. He also went to visit her, which is pretty extraordinary. I mean, the President of the United States just showed up on her doorstep one day to thank her for her interest and faith in him. And her description in a subsequent letter of that visit is really terrific, too. I mean, it seems, you get the sense from that letter and her description of the encounter that Chester Arthur was sort of... he said to her, listen, you expect maybe too much of me. I can't be an angel. I'm in politics, and maybe you don't understand some of the things I have to do. But, and then of course he saved the letters when he ordered everything else to be burned. I think that's an incredible detail. Here's a guy who he was close to death, and he said, just burn all of it. I'm embarrassed about a lot of the things I did. But please save these letters. I want these 23 letters saved. And it's really a wonderful experience to be able to go to the Library of Congress and actually see those letters. And thankfully I'm sorry?
Are you recommending that we try to write a letter?
Well, 2 years ago, I thought maybe, Ivanka maybe, I don't know. Yes, I don't know. Maybe you could tweet at him. I don't know, but I don't know that he reads tweets. I think he just sends them.
I've been working on something having to do with the Harding administration, and Harding's wife burned all of his letters and papers for a week after he died in office. How common was it for people to ask for their papers to be burned? I mean, you can't destroy things as easily now. Are they the only two that burn everything?
Well, I mean, you go to the Library of Congress, for example, and the collections of the other presidents are pretty substantial, almost all of them. So I don't think it was common, certainly for people who were presidents. Now, Harding had a lot to hide, personally and politically, so he also had good reason or his wife had good reason to burn those letters, yeah. It makes you think, though, it was difficult for me to write this book without having so much material, but it also makes you think about how future historians will write about our period when people don't really write letters anymore. I mean, letters can be, reading letters, some of the letters that survive from the 1850s that Chester Arthur wrote to his good friends back in upstate New York. I mean, it's like sitting on his shoulder, looking over his shoulder as he's expressing his deepest thoughts. And it's really something. I mean, it's a very moving experience. Julia Sand lived to a ripe old age, never told anybody about this special relationship with the president, never married, and ended up dying, I think, that in 1931 or something like that. Well, the thing with at the time she was writing Arthur, she had some. It's unclear exactly what was wrong with her. She did talk, there was talk of spinal pain, and she said she was, for periods, confined to her bed, but then there are other times where she, for example, she writes him a letter from Saratoga. She's at Saratoga, and she goes out for a carriage ride. So I think there were periods when she was an invalid, but she wasn't, it wasn't all the time. It wasn't a permanent state.
Perhaps one last question. Right here. Go ahead.
His wife died from influenza. She was out waiting outside in the cold. And his children, he had a son and a daughter, and the daughter was in the White House with him. The son was in college for most of that time, but actually, like his father, he liked to have a good time. He would come. He often came back from Princeton with his college buddies and had raucous parties in the White House. In fact, at one point he got in trouble. Somehow he ended up skinny dipping in one of the fountains with the Prince of Siam or something. I mean, he was a real character. One of his descendants is here today, so perhaps he has some more information on the Arthurs. But no one, they were not involved in politics. And in fact, one of the things that Chester Arthur did toward the end of his life, when he was ill, is he summoned his son and told him not to get involved in politics. He said he had to do too many unpleasant things as a politician.